I've watched this happen more than once. Someone's cleaning out a barn, finds an old rusted metal seat that used to sit on a horse-drawn plow or an early tractor, and either tosses it or turns it into a garden stool without a second thought. Most of them genuinely are just old seats, small, rusted, easy to dismiss as scrap metal shaped a little strangely. But before we're done here, I'll tell you about one that turned out to be worth more than the entire machine it came from, the tractor and everything else attached to it combined. Start with the ordinary ones, because I owe you the honest baseline first. A plain seat with no maker's name cast into it, nothing but a plain diamond or star pattern punched into the metal, typically sells for $30 to $50. That's the honest reality for most of what turns up, and I won't pretend otherwise. But even a plain seat can climb past that, sometimes as high as $200, once you factor in the actual shape and the quality of the casting itself. Genuine early seats have a slightly rough, hand-finished texture where the mold was cleaned up by a person, not stamped out identically by a machine, and that small texture difference is worth running your thumb across before you decide a plain seat is worthless. The pattern punched into the surface matters too, the diamonds, stars, or simple ridges that were never just decoration. They were there to keep a farmer from sliding off during a long day behind a horse-drawn implement, and the specific pattern a company used often stayed consistent enough that collectors can narrow down roughly which decade a plain, unmarked seat came from just by the shape of that texture. Here's where it gets interesting, because the moment a real maker's name gets cast into the metal, the whole conversation changes. Companies like Deering, Victor and Baker and Hamilton's Champion line stamp their name directly into the seat itself, usually right where your weight would sit, worn smoother than the rest of the surface from decades of actual use. These were working companies building real farm equipment for real customers, not decorative pieces, which is exactly why the name being legible at all after a century of weather and use is worth something on its own. A named seat in decent condition regularly climbs past the plain ones, and the specific name matters enormously, since some companies only made implements for a short stretch before folding or merging into a larger one, which limits exactly how many seats with that name were ever cast in the first place. Johnston Harvester, out of Batavia, New York, is exactly that kind of name, a real company with a real history that eventually merged into a much larger corporation, which means every surviving seat still carrying the original Johnston name is a piece of a business that technically stopped existing under that identity generations ago. And that's not even the detail that separates the real ones from the fakes, and this next part is genuinely important because there's a specific reproduction out there that's fooled more people than almost anything else in this hobby. You'll sometimes see a cast iron seat stamped with a running deer, the initials JD, and the number 1847 right on the metal. It looks convincing at first glance, and it's sold constantly online for anywhere from $20 to nearly $100, as though it's a genuine antique. It is not. Real collectors have spent years tracing this exact seat back to modern manufacturing overseas, and there are two tells that give it away every single time, once you know to actually look for them, instead of trusting the shine and the confident lettering. First, a genuine antique seat almost never has a date cast into it at all, since that wasn't something companies bothered doing back then. Second, and this is the detail that actually settles it, the deer on the real John Deere trademark runs in one specific direction, and on this reproduction, it runs the exact opposite way. If you've got one of these sitting in a barn with a running deer and a date stamped into it, you're not holding history. You're holding a decoration. And one collector who tracked this exact seat down actually built it into a stool on purpose, specifically to have a physical example on hand to show newcomers exactly what to avoid. That's not the only pattern getting copied either. Certain other well-known names, A company called Buckeye out of Akron, the Jones Rake Line, and Rock Island seats have all been reproduced heavily enough that real collectors specifically warn newcomers to watch for suspiciously low prices on those exact names, since a genuine example almost never sells that cheap. Learning to recognize which specific names get faked most often is honestly half the skill in collecting these. It's skill almost nobody outside a small, serious community ever bothers to pick up. The tell collectors watch for isn't usually the seat itself, since a well-made reproduction can look genuinely convincing in a photograph. It's the price. A real, established name selling for far less than what the reference books and sold listings say it should is worth treating with real suspicion before anything else. Round seats are their own separate category entirely, and they deserve a moment on their own before we go any further. Unlike the more common triangular or fan-shaped seats, a genuinely round seat is rarer simply because fewer companies bothered making that shape, and collectors treat round examples as a distinct tier worth chasing on their own, regardless of which maker's name happens to be cast into it. If you're sorting through several old seats, and one of them has a genuinely circular profile instead of the familiar fan shape widening out toward the back, set that one aside first, before you even start reading any of the lettering. The rim is worth a close look too on a round example, since the edge on some was finished with a rolled or beaded lip rather than left plain and flat, a small manufacturing detail that adds one more layer of rarity on top of the shape itself. There's a real organized community behind all of this too, which surprises most people the first time they hear about it, especially anyone who spent years assuming an old farm seat was purely a piece of scrap metal with a shape that happened to fit a person. A group called the Cast Iron Seat Collectors Association has been keeping track of this exact hobby since 1971, maintaining an actual database of what specific seats have sold for over the years. New collectors who join without knowing that database exists routinely overpay for their first few seats simply because they had no real reference point, which tells you something important. Members of that organization travel to tractor shows, flea markets, and farm auctions, specifically hunting for seats, sometimes trading rather than buying, comparing notes with each other the same way any serious collecting community does. This isn't a fringe curiosity. It's a genuine, organized collecting world with real history behind it, sitting quietly on top of objects most people treat as scrap. And that finally brings me to the seat I promised you at the start. A collector once picked up what looked like an ordinary implement seat attached to an old Evans seed planter, the kind of machine that would have sat in a barn for decades doing exactly what it was built to do. That entire seed planter, the whole machine, sold at auction for around $3,500. But once the seat itself was properly identified and separated out, it turned out to be worth more on its own than everything else attached to that machine combined. The seat wasn't decoration on a farm tool. It was the actual treasure the farm tool happened to be carrying around the whole time, bolted to the very thing everyone assumed was the valuable part. Condition still matters here the same way it matters everywhere else, but maybe not in the direction you'd assume. Surface rust and honest wear from decades of actual use don't necessarily hurt a seat's value, and in fact, that worn, smooth patch where someone genuinely sat for years is often exactly what tells you it's real, rather than a decorative reproduction that never left a store shelf. What actually hurts value is cracking, especially through the mounting bracket where the seat originally attached to the machine, since a crack there can't be repaired without destroying the very thing collectors are paying for. A light coat of original paint still clinging to the metal, even worn down to bare patches in places, is worth leaving completely alone rather than scraping off, since that surviving paint is one more small piece of evidence that the seat is exactly what it claims to be. Sandblasting or repainting a genuinely old seat to make it look fresh and presentable does exactly the opposite of what most sellers hope, stripping away the very evidence a buyer would otherwise use to confirm it's real. Here's what ties every single one of these together, and it comes down to the same handful of things every time. Whether there's a real maker's name cast into the metal, or an unusual round shape that stands apart from the common ones. Whether it matches a known reproduction pattern, the running deer facing the wrong way, a date that never should have been cast in the first place, a name selling suspiciously cheap, and whether the wear on the seat itself tells you the truth about whether someone genuinely used it or it was manufactured yesterday to look old. None of that requires an expert eye. It just requires actually turning the thing over before you decide a rusty old seat belongs in the scrap pile or the garden. A seat that's been bolted to a stool in someone's garage for 30 years hasn't been getting less valuable the whole time it sat there. It's just been waiting for someone to actually flip it over and read what's cast into the bottom. My husband still has one of these bolted onto an old shop stool in the garage, and every time I ask if he's ever actually checked what it's stamped with, he just tells me it's more comfortable than it looks and changes the subject. So before that old seat gets scrapped, turned into a stool, or handed off in a yard sale box for a couple of dollars, take a real look first. Check for a maker's name, look at the shape, and if you see a running deer with a date on it, know exactly what you're actually holding before you get excited. Tell me down in the comments if you've got one of these old seats sitting somewhere in your own barn or garage, and whether you've ever actually turned it over to look, because I have a feeling a few of you already know exactly where to check. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications, because next time we're staying right here on the farm for something else entirely, and it's hiding in a place even less obvious than this one.